Okay, you okay for me to start it now?
Yep.
Great. So just wait about 30 seconds for people to come in. Yeah.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. We're delighted so many people were able to join us for today's event. Brexit, all change now, question mark. Today's event is brought to you by TASC, the think tank for action on social change. My name is Elaine Stephen. I'll be the chair for today. I'm on the board of TASC. So we've a good lineup of speaker and panel members. Some of them are under time pressure, so our main speaker has to leave to go to RTE for an interview at 1 o'clock, which is interesting. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our main speaker. Paul Blomfield, MP, is the Labour spokesman for Brexit and EU negotiations. So without further delay, I'm going to hand over to Paul. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Elaine, and delighted to join you. This event couldn't be more timely, really, as we're anticipating some conclusion to the long, drawn-out process within the next week. I mean, perhaps is worth recapping from the opposition's point of view, from Labour's point of view, that just very briefly, over the last 4 years, which have been an extraordinary period for British politics, that we clearly campaigned to remain in the European Union. We thought it was the best interests of our country and the continent we share. Having lost the referendum, we immediately voted to trigger Article 50 and wanted to see from the talks the best possible outcome for Britain and for Europe. And that meant a close relationship, and we came to that position where we were supporting and pressing for a customs union, replicating the current arrangements of the European Union's customs union, and alignment with the single market, so together with continued participation in all the agencies and partnerships that we built together over the 45 years of our membership. Obviously, there wasn't an opportunity to build a consensus around the direction of the talks within the British Parliament. It is worth remembering, because often we are, it's suggested from those who were the fiercest advocates of Brexit within the UK, that is all the fault of the Labour Party and the other opposition parties. It is worth remembering that during most of that period, if the Conservative government had been able to deliver on their majority, they could have secured a deal. And it was often the divisions within the Conservative Party which have been the driver for this whole debate, including Boris Johnson's willingness to prevent Theresa May achieving the deal that she was seeking, that gets us to where we are today. But clearly, December changed everything. The general election gave Johnson an 80-seat majority. It was a process in which he purged his party of its more reasonable voices, and it gave him a mandate for the deal that he had secured, the withdrawal agreement, obviously incorporated the Northern Ireland Protocol. I mean, from Labour's point of view, I think we recognised honestly there were only ever 3 ways of resolving the issues in relation to the Irish border. Either there's a border on the island of Ireland, which we all opposed, or there was a border down the Irish Sea, which Johnson gave clear pledges he would never agree to, or, as we wanted, alignment between the whole of the United Kingdom and the EU. Johnson, having torpedoed Theresa May's deal, then largely adopted it, and replacing simply the backstop with effectively a border down the Irish Sea. Since December, as an opposition, we've been pressing on 2 issues, which we might want to talk about. One is obviously about preparedness for the departure from the European Union transition period, because deal or no deal, there's a fundamental change in the way that trade operates and Britain's position. And it is, from our point of view, it's a point of huge concern that the government is unprepared in so very many ways and has been unable to assist business in preparing. And that's not just, and much of the public narrative has been about Dover, but we and the border there, but we're equally concerned about the routes across to Ireland from Holyhead and Stranraer, and the lack of preparedness on those ports. Clearly, the big issue is the question of whether or not a deal will be obtained. Since the December election, we can no longer, with Johnson's 80-seat majority, shape events as an opposition, but what we can try to do is to hold the government, and what we have been trying to do is to hold the government to account for the agreement that they reached and the promise that they made to the British people. Now, there clearly are two strands to that. It's the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration. To a very large extent, since we left at the end of January, the government have been trying to discern serious parts of the political declaration, and we've been trying to hold them to it, because that was the pledge, that was the oven-ready deal that Boris Johnson promised. He said, you know, pop it in the oven, gas mark for 30 minutes, Bob's your uncle, all sorted, new relationship with the European Union. Well, it obviously hasn't worked out like that. We've been past 4 deadlines. He said first the deal could be secured by July. It clearly was never going to be. He then said by September, so that David Frost could take up his new post. It wasn't. He then imposed his own deadline on the European Union of the middle of October, saying he would walk away from the talks if a deal wasn't forthcoming by then. It wasn't. We moved on. And now we've passed the deadline of the 31st of October, which most people thought was the point at which a deal would need to be secured. I think it's still our instincts that an agreement will be reached, not least because the consequences of not doing so are too damaging for Britain and for our place in the world. But from our point of view, the deal has to be based on the commitments made, as I say, to the British people, but also signed up to with the European Union in the political declaration. And there are key strands there. One is about barrier-free trade. It's about shared standards and some alignment on standards, particularly in relation to employment rights and environmental rights. It's about a security partnership that works for us all. And there's a critical strand in terms of honouring the Good Friday Agreement and the commitment to the peace process in Northern Ireland. We certainly recognise the importance of a deal in terms of UK-Irish relations and UK-Irish trade, important both to Ireland and to us. I mean, as I was in a meeting with Simon Coveney last week, and he reminded us that that Ireland is the UK's 5th largest export market, and of course, you know, almost 6% of all UK exports go to Ireland. It's worth more, as Simon said, than our exports to India and Brazil combined. So hugely important in terms of trade and, of course, in terms of our wider political relationship. Clearly, if we turn out with no deal, then it damages the UK, it damages our place in the world. It raises the issue of tariffs and barriers to trade, not simply with the rest of Europe, but of course the special position Northern Ireland is within the agreement that's been reached. And no deal clearly would strain the protocol. Nothing has been, this whole process has clearly not been helped by the Internal Market Bill, which was an extraordinary move by the Johnson government, which took our breath away. We weren't anticipating that at all. We had always seen, as I think much of the world has seen, the UK as a country which honours treaties and is committed to the rule of law. And the cavalier way in which the Johnson administration were prepared to throw that out of the window, for what purpose wasn't entirely clear. If they had thought that it was going to advance the negotiations, clearly they were wrong, because it has undermined trust and and damage that process. I think that those who were gaming it within number 10 must have been surprised by the degree of opposition that there was even within their own party. And that was reflected in the House of Lords on Monday of this week, when by, I think, a historic majority, the House of Lords voted to take out that Section 5 of the Internal Market Bill relating to the revocation of the commitments in the Northern Ireland Protocol and the revoking the treaty and in breach of international law. And clearly that majority included very vocal members of the Conservative benches, including the Brexiteer and former Conservative leader Michael Howard. That must have taken the government by surprise. But that whole process was extremely, the whole move by the Conservatives to introduce the internal market bill was hugely damaging, and has undermined our place both in the negotiations, but also our place in the world, as the new President of the United States has made absolutely clear. I'm conscious of the time constraints. Perhaps I'll finish at that point, and we can share our thoughts on how things are going to pan out over the week ahead.
Thanks very much, Paul. Yeah, very interesting there. And we'll probably come back to some of those points in the questions. Just to let people know that if you want to submit a question, I see one has come in on chat during the panel discussion, please do so. Now, let me introduce our panel who will respond to Paul. Our first panelist is Matt Carthy, who's a Sinn Féin politician, has been TD for Cavan Monaghan since the 2020 general election. Esther Lynch is Deputy General Secretary of ETUC, the European Trade Union Confederation, and Danny McCoy is the CEO of IBEC. So I am going to ask Matt to kick off and respond to Paul.
Elaine, and just to, at the outset, thank Paul for his own presentation and for being part of this discussion, and in particular to thank TASC for organising this seminar. As you say, I've been a TD for a border constituency since February, and prior to that I was a member of the European Parliament where I represented all of the southern border constituencies, and there were times over the period since 2016 when Brexit had just became all-consuming, and throughout that period of time it was impossible to think that you could be dealing with a scenario that was worse than a no-deal Brexit. Little did we ever contemplate a no-deal Brexit on top of a global pandemic, and that yet is where we're at, to such a degree that Brexit is actually down the list of issues that people are talking about at a time when the negotiations are entering, as Paul has said, a very defining moment. I suppose just to reiterate, it probably doesn't need reiterating, but let's remind ourselves that Brexit is bad for Ireland, no matter what, and that would be the case no matter what the constitutional makeup of our own country was. Britain is our biggest trading partner by far. It's particularly important for some of our more important sectors, particularly in relation to regional development and rural development, obviously the agri-food sector. Britain stands between us and the rest of the European Union. So any Brexit deal that isn't full and open trade is going to have a negative impact on our country, and that would be the case no matter what. And I think it's fair to say now that whatever happens over the next number of weeks in terms of the ongoing talks, we're not going to have full and open trade. That's not where the British government are heading to, and we need to try and minimise the impact of that. But that's going to require responses in terms of financial packages, in terms of trying to secure other markets, all the things that government have been talking about. We had the omnibus bill before the Dáil this week, and speaker after speaker said this is about control, and unfortunately there's so many parts of this that are now out of our control. All of the problems that Brexit presents, though, are multiplied by the fact that we're on a divided island, and the fact that we're now faced and have been to some degree already working on the basis that one part of our country is inside the European Union, operating to EU rules and all that comes with that, and another part of our country has been taken out of the European Union against the democratically expressed wishes of the people who live there. The people in the north voted to remain part of the European Union. They have now been faced with the prospect of taking it out. And of course, that's become a key crux of all parts of the negotiations, is how do you minimize the damage that will cause in terms of economic, in terms of social and political, and how do you ensure that our peace agreements are protected in all of that? Because the trade is important, the politics, the social aspects are all important. At a European level, the crucial argument that I think crystallized the reason why the EU invested so much energy and time in terms of the position with regard to the North was the issue of citizenship. Under the Good Friday Agreement and international law, people who live in the north of Ireland can declare themselves either British, Irish, or both. That means that essentially if they want to be, they're Irish citizens. If they're Irish citizens, that means that de facto they're European Union citizens. So the big question with the European Union has always been, how do we protect the European Union citizenship of a set of people who are being taken out of the European Union against their will? And in many respects, the position of the British government has been just trust our bona fides on this. Yet, at the same time, when it came down to the crux of it, a Secretary of State who has responsibility for the North stood up in the Houses of Parliament and said that the British government were intentionally breaching international law, and that has done damage that I think will last for a long period of time. So not to dwell on the point, I think it means, and I think the lesson from all of this is that we shouldn't be afraid of having big constitutional conversations and having them in a very sensible and pragmatic way. The key lesson is that we never in this country want to make the same mistake of the Brexiteers, to talk about constitutional change in the macro sense without having any detail as to what that constitutional change will actually look like in practice. So I'm a United Irelander, and I believe very strongly, and more so as a result of Brexit, that we need to have the conversations now need to be all embracing in relation to what a United Ireland might look like, and particularly with a focus on the rights of those people who don't consider themselves to be Irish citizens. And the final point I'll make for now, in terms of the big conversations that we need to have, Brexit happened for a reason, and a lot of those reasons, as we know, were very malign reasons. It was driven in part by xenophobia and by an ill-informed or misinforming campaign. But there were also other reasons why people genuinely decided that their country would be better off outside of the European Union, and we shouldn't just dismiss those. We're dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, and one of the key to the responses, the reasons that governments have been able to respond to those challenges that have come about, have been the suspension of key EU rules, particularly in around state aid and the fiscal rule packages. And I think seeing how the suspension of those rules has allowed us to address the challenges of COVID, it also, in retrospect, shows some of the difficulties that were made around the financial crash. So I think one of the lessons that we need to take from Brexit and from all of the debacles that we've seen over the past 4 years is that there should be no conversation that we shouldn't be afraid to have. And that includes addressing some of the democratic deficiencies that are at the heart of the European Union in order to build support and to build strength across the European Union for all the challenges that rest. But the next number of weeks are going to be all defining in terms of the future of our country, and we all need to remain vigilant. I'll leave it at that. Thank you again, Elaine, and thank you to TASC.
Great, thank you, Matt. You make a number of great points there, touching on the deal or no deal, how bad Brexit is for Ireland, and the regional development effect, and particularly, I presume, around the border region as well, and the issue of citizenship, and also not to ignore what caused Brexit and how we're responding to COVID and what we can learn from that. So very interesting. Thank you, Matt. I'm going to go now to Danny McCoy of IBEC. Danny, if you want to respond to Paul.
Yeah, thanks very much, Elaine and Paul. Great pleasure to hear your remarks and follow on from what Matt said there. Trying to be brief, I suppose. My own personal journey with Brexit goes back to having to respond to David Cameron's Bloomberg speech back in January of 2013. So this feels like it's been with us a long time in a slow motion pattern. So those of us who've been following it closely have probably forgotten more terms and euphemisms along the way of backstops and dynamic alignments and so on. But we're now clearly at the sharp end. So, you know, Brexit has happened on the 31st of January. It's really the details being filled in. And so from a business perspective, I think a lot of people are getting obsessed, rightly, with the logistics around the trade issues. That's distracting in some ways because there are much bigger issues involved as well for the business model and the freedoms around services, people, and capital, and much more of the drivers of value in actually both islands are predicated on those other areas. But because of the tangible nature of goods and the movement of goods, it does bring, you know, an emphasis. It's also worth noting, and I actually saw the photograph to do the mental calc on this, is that if you can envisage Britain not being the land bridge, just disappearing, how far Ireland is actually away from the continent is pretty sobering when you have the conversation now about potentially the land bridge not being functioning for, you know, a matter of weeks. How you make the trade flows from Ireland to the continent, you're really talking about significant disruption. And again, this disruptive effect, I think, is capturing people very dramatically. All of these things are noise, and they will, you know, we're capable of getting over this from both sides. But the truth of the matter is, for our society, Brexit is by far the bigger issue. COVID is horrible, but it is actually a moment in time, dramatic as it is. Brexit is actually an economic order change. It's not a relationship change. It's a fundamental economic order change. And some of the things that aren't being discussed in the Republic of Ireland, I think are quite dramatic as well. If you look at the protocol, the Northern Ireland Protocol, which I think now with some certainty, given the dynamics of even the Biden presidency is going to really force this issue, that is with pretty much 99% confidence we will be in that arrangement where Northern Ireland is pivoting between in the EU single market and in the UK custom arrangement. That means that if you narrowly look at trade in goods, Northern Ireland, and then by extension the island of Ireland, is going to be a unique position of being central to three major trade deals that will need to emerge in the next 4 to 5 years. The largest one is the EU-US one, and the pressure for TTIP to come back on the agenda from the European side should be an imperative, given that the EU is beginning to disappear down in the V shape of the relationship between the US and China. The EU has to, for its citizens, actually take a much stronger coordinated leadership role. And one of those will be to actually strike a trade deal in a version of TTIP. Leave that aside, but taking it that there's an EU-US trade arrangement, the UK clearly need arrangement UK-EU, and then also by extension, looking for a deal UK-US. In the Venn diagram of that, one part is in all three deals, which is the pivot that is Northern Ireland in this new arrangement. That is a fundamental business and a trade and economic issue, which I think gets very little airplay. And it's one of the big interests, not just as a guarantor of the Good Friday Agreement, but one of the actual business interests that the US will have for the next 4 to 5 years. The last thing, maybe just to put it in there though, is that accepting that the withdrawal agreement will be invoked, honored might be a different issue in terms of honor base, but it will be invoked, is that the Article 11 about the court in that I think is really significant for the kind of totality of relationships, to use that term from the Good Friday Agreement. That gives this shared island and the momentum for using the word shared, which I think is probably a better word, because when you say all island, it can sound like all Ireland, and you know everyone gets into knots. In the shared island dimension, we have a collective responsibility to ensure that we don't have a mini Brexit moment in the year 2025 when Northern Ireland has to determine whether they want to stick with these arrangements. Because that act of Northern Ireland deciding that they don't want part of the EU single market at that moment will bring all of these border issues back into play again. And so the border on the island issue, which, as Paul rightly said, nobody wants that, and that will be the case in 4 years' time as well. If that's the case, and Northern Ireland decides they don't want part of this arrangement of the single market, a border to protect the integrity of the European Union comes back into play again, and it'll have to be somewhere. And so I think, we're all obsessing by COVID, about the trade deal and so on. There's actually a fundamental economic order change going to be on this island from January onwards. I think everybody, to Matt's point there, needs to start to prepare for that and to make sure that we don't, whatever the decision is, that we don't allow what happened in the UK to have an ill-informed debate on something as constitutionally fundamental as that. And I think the business community is really seized about the day after. Lots of people are talking about the trade, but I think that's much more fundamental. Economic order change, not economic arrangement change. I'll stop at that point, I think.
Thank you, Danny. Definitely food for thought, a fundamental order change. I know Matt has a hard stop shortly, but if there's any chance just to get a question to you, Matt, before you go, it's sort of hearing what Danny is saying as well. It's relevant to the border region, and Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland has been hard hit by COVID and lockdowns. What do you think needs to be done to help business there, especially considering what Danny is saying about the negative impacts of Brexit?
Well, first of all, I think COVID is a stark reminder of what happens when we don't coordinate things on an all-Ireland level. So we've had situations where, and at the moment, there's rightly a focus on the numbers in the north, which are very concerning. But it has been on the flip side. We have had higher instances on the southern side of the border in the past. And one of the crucial challenges has been, particularly for businesses operating on the border, has been that there'll be different regulations and restrictions in place at different times, north and south. So we need to try and move beyond that in the short term. But that's, I suppose, just crystallizing the challenges that present as a result of Brexit and the competing demands that we're going to see occurring. So, Danny will be the first to say what business wants more than anything is certainty, and we're at a period of what has been prolonged uncertainty. It's quite amazing to see the resilience of the small and medium enterprise sector that have just managed to get along and trudge along, but there hasn't been any level of growth, and there probably won't be any level of growth unless we can put in place that certainty over the coming months. And that therein lies the challenges. And to me, as I mentioned earlier on, I think we shouldn't be afraid of having bigger conversations. I think economically, never mind my own political viewpoint, I think economically we are too small of a country to have duplicity of services and to have economic development agencies, for example, that aren't only operating back to back, but in many instances are actually competing against each other. That's going to become even more problematic over the time ahead. So to me, the big challenge for us is whether or not we're willing to have big conversations. There has been a reluctance for obvious reasons and for natural reasons, but sometimes change can't be stopped. And sometimes the best that we can hope to do is manage it in a positive way. I happen to think that the change that's coming is a very positive and a progressive change. It's a legitimate aspiration to see us dismantling the border, but it needs to be done, as I say, in a managed way as part of, or as a result of, a dialogue. And anybody who says, well, we shouldn't have that dialogue now, or that dialogue will be disruptive, I think they're ignoring what's actually happening in business circles as much as anywhere else. This is, if nothing else, it's going to be interesting times. I have concerns that the politics of Toryism could end up creating even more uncertainty, which, as I have said, is actually the last thing that any of us need right now.
Okay, thanks very much, Matt, and thanks for your contribution.
And thank you, and apologise that I have to run off now in the next minute or two.
Thank you. Paul, if I can come back to you, and I'm wondering if what you've heard, sorry, our third panel member is having connection problems, so I'm going to, I may come back to her later. But in terms of what you're hearing from Danny and Matt, is there an understanding of the complexity, that even that fundamental order change that Danny was talking about? Would there be sufficient understanding of that in the UK Parliament?
I think there's been, it's fair to say, a growing understanding as we've been through this process. I mean, the whole Brexit referendum was fought on simple issues, giving people binary choices that didn't reflect the complexity of what really was at stake in totality. But I think there has been a probably lack of appreciation of some of the consequences. I have to say, I mean, obviously we're talking today about the consequences facing Ireland and Northern Ireland, but right across the board, every sector group, every business group I meet to talk to about their concerns introduce, and have talked to over the last 4 years, introduce a new issue that is uniquely problematic for them. That was never considered at the point that the decision was made. I think for Boris Johnson, there's been a bit of a learning process, hasn't there? Because he, like a bull in a china shop, kind of barged into these negotiations. He made commitments about what sort of deal he was prepared to settle for. He made commitments to the DUP. He made promises to Northern Ireland businesses, and then he had to confront the reality of the situation that he faced, in a sense, the internal market bill was chickens coming home to roost in terms of the recognition that of the problems that he had created in the protocol that he'd signed up to. But I think that responding more widely, I mean, I think Matt made some important points on the importance of full and open trade. I think it was, I take very much the issue that he flagged up about citizenship as an important question, which in a sense is a kind of spotlight on the unique position of Northern Ireland. Danny, I remember the Cameron Bloomberg speech very well, and much of my life in politics has been dominated by all of this ever since. You're also right to make the point that some of the discussion on trade has been a distraction. There are 11 strands to the negotiations that are taking place at the moment. And if you listen to the public discourse, you would imagine this was simply about a deal on trading goods. The deal on services, which is likely to be deeply damaging to the UK, isn't much talked about. Yesterday I was highlighting across the dispatch box with Michael Gove the UK government's failure to achieve the sort of deal we need in terms of security, and there are all the other strands as well. I think you also make an important point, Danny, in relation to the central position of Northern Ireland in relation to the bigger trade deals, and there's a choice underlying that for the UK too, that even an economy of our size in the modern world has to choose where it aligns. And those choices, there are only 3 choices. There's China, which is clearly not where we're going to align. There's America, where some of what Philip Hammond described as the Brexit extremists within the Conservative Party would like to align. And then there is where Britain naturally sits as part of the European continent with a common culture, common values, and shared strategic interests. I think, Danny, you also make a really important point in relation to 2025, which is it's often overlooked, but it's certainly going to be hanging on there as a significant moment.
Paul, you mentioned there about the citizenship. How do you think Brexit will affect devolution in general in the UK, and in particular in Northern Ireland?
Well, ultimately it's going to be a decision for the Northern Ireland people. And it's probably not helpful for me to speculate. It depends very much how things, I guess, pan out. I mean, in a sense, Northern Ireland has unique opportunities arising from its position as a result of the protocol, both in the UK single market and in the European Union's single market. So there are things. There are big chances to seize there. More widely, I mean, Brexit isn't playing out well in terms of the devolution settlement. Everybody will be aware of the anger in Scotland and the way that the debate there is tipping, and that's been accentuated by the way in which the UK government has failed to engage effectively and properly with the devolved administrations, whether that's Scotland, Northern Ireland, or indeed Wales, on so many issues. I mean, there was no effective consultation with those administrations on the internal market bill, and the objectionable part of the internal market bill in relation to the Northern Ireland Protocol and the rule of law was only one part of it. There's been no effective discussion with the devolved administrations about how the UK internal market is going to operate, and both the Welsh and Scottish administrations have got huge concerns about the absence of agreed common frameworks.
Thanks, Paul. And before I come to our third panelist who's managed to connect back in, Esther, can I just ask you there about that internal market bill? Does the vote in the House of Lords, is that just a slap on the wrist, or is it a significant setback?
No, I think it's more significant than a slap on the wrist. I mean, obviously, within our curious constitutional settlement, the House of Lords has limited powers, but the strength of opposition on this issue was so enormous and included so many senior Conservatives. And I think the resolve within the House of Lords to press this issue right to the last possible point in terms of the opportunities that they have is very serious. It's of significance that the government have chosen not to bring the legislation back to the Commons until 7th or 8th of December. And I guess you could read into that an assumption that by that point there may have been an agreement which would make Section 5 of the bill unnecessary, and therefore the amendments that were passed by the Lords will be doing the government a favour, but we'll have to see.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Now I'm going to turn to Esther. Welcome back, Esther. Esther is Deputy General Secretary of the European Trade Union Confederation. So Esther, I hope you were able to hear the speaker and the panelists, and perhaps you can respond.
I heard part, and I want to apologise to everybody. I don't know what's wrong with my system today, but so I hope you can all hear me. Yes. So for the ETUC, we've been very clear all along about the importance of a level playing field, and I was very interested yesterday to see Michel Barnier's tweet, him off looking for a level playing field, and we're all looking for that because so much rides on it. And if I could just take the opportunity just to highlight why the level playing field for us is so important. So we're really concerned, of course, as everybody else is, about the no deal, but we're also concerned about a bare bones deal. And the reason we're concerned about a bare bones deal that, for example, will only deal with something like goods and the tariff on goods, and how the airplanes will fly over and some of those matters, is because it's a massive misunderstanding to think that you can separate services from goods, or that you can separate out citizens' rights from the real economy, or that you can deal with workers' rights in isolation from their social security. All of these things we've spent 50 years integrating, and now to imagine that it's easy just to deal with one thing and then everything else will be okay, from our assessment, just isn't there. And the example that I've often heard given by my colleagues in the metal industries is that they say, okay, perhaps the parts will be able to move, but the use of those parts, the fixing of them, the engineering information that has to be associated to be able to use those parts when they turn up in the construction, that requires the free movement of services as well as the free movement of the goods. And so it's a massive misunderstanding, we think, which is this developing discussion, which seems to be about where we'll have a bare bones and then fix everything else out. So we're equally as concerned about a bare bones deal as we are about a no deal. We're also concerned about the timing now, because there doesn't seem to be a full appreciation on the UK negotiating side of how complex the decision-making is for the rest of Europe and how bound by rules that is. So, so the time, I mean, is already very tight. It's becoming clearer that the deal is more than likely going to be a mixed deal. So it will include competence from that the EU has, but also will include competence for the member states. And that will need member states to ratify it. Now, everybody in Ireland knows how long and difficult a journey that is to persuade, to explain what the content of the deal is, to say why we're calling on workers to support it, or why you'd be calling on workers not to support it. And so we're just very, very concerned about a massive underestimation about what's involved in ratifying the deal. From the other let's say, aspect of all of this is how COVID is playing into that discussion. And what I'm seeing, and I'm having meetings online around Europe with workers, all sectors, all occupations, all careers. And the discussion is developing about a renationalization, because people have got a fright with COVID, and they got a fright about how ready and able their local community, their member state, and indeed Europe is to be able to take care of its fundamental needs, in this case healthcare. But people are now thinking, well, maybe it will be other things too. And I think combined within that, the divisive discussions, the us and them narrative, which America, in fairness, now is beginning to turn the tide on. But this us and them narrative has been developed, and in particular by the current government in the UK. So the idea that there's this well of support out there behind the deal when it comes to people voting on it. Like I think that there are that really hasn't been thought about sufficiently by the current negotiators on the UK side, about how, you know, that both sides have to ratify it. So that's why I think involving workers and their unions is so important, so that workers and their unions are going on the same journey as the policymakers and the negotiators are, so that when the deal is concluded, people will have some understanding of the content of it. They'll understand what it means for them and how this deal will be better than a no deal, and that we have to be there fast to do that. And so this constant news stories, which is about, you know, what's in it for us. And personally, I refuse to go to any event which is Brexit, what's in it for us, because the whole frame of it is the wrong way to think about it. What it needs to be is Brexit. How do we ensure that everything, that the way of life, the solidarity, and that we're not all at each other's throats can continue. So I just want to say, like, I'm sure that's not as well put as it should be and as it needs to be, But I want to say that that the way in which the deal is discussed and presented will be critical in how people who have to vote on it subsequently will think about it. I think then just want to say a little bit about the ongoing concerns we have, in particular in relation to the governance of any deal. The massive blow that was done by statements saying that treaties once signed can be ignored. That we need to have confidence in the governance of the deal, and then we also need to have a confidence that the final deal isn't one based on a race to the bottom on employment conditions and standards, and that we have to acknowledge that there will be job losses because of Brexit. And that what has to happen in the European Union in particular is that there needs to be a Brexit adjustment fund, and that needs to support industries, it needs to support workers and their incomes, and it needs to plot a pathway, a new industrial strategy for the European Union, and that needs, and with a level playing field, that means that it can be a lot more joined up. Just one final point to give an example of that. So Galileo, I believe the satellite Galileo is what's needed for all driverless technology. So for the UK to be part of, we say, the innovation on driverless technology, like including in the deal things like that. So for Europe. Big Europe is playing a role on ethical, safe, properly regulated driverless technology. Like that's all that has to all be part of the discussion and all part of the deal. So that's why for us a level playing field is important. It's not a simple tick box exercise, and that it needs to be about making sure that workers aren't put at each other's throats. Can't be just about goods, has to be about services as well, has to deal with social security rights, the right to work, the recognition of qualifications, and has to have a credible supervisory system whereby workers and their unions, if it's not been upheld, have a place where they can go complain and have those complaints resolved. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Esther. Yes, Paul had made the point as well about services, that there's so much discussion about goods and there's lots of other factors that are not being considered. Paul, I just wondered the point that Esther was making about the complexity on the EU side, you know, that there's two sides to the negotiations, and you've been representing Labour in the EU negotiations. Is there an understanding of that greater complexity or extra complexity in terms of ratifying the deal?
And I have to say, it often appears for the UK government, there's not much understanding of many strands of the complexity of what's going on. But I think that, I think we recognise as an opposition, and I'm sure the government must, that what we're seeking to secure is a mixed deal, that it will therefore need the ratification of national parliaments as well as the European Parliament, and indeed regional parliaments in some cases, and that's been an issue in relation to the approval for the Canada deal that the EU struck. And that's why I made the point at the outset that I think many of us were surprised that we went past the October 31st deadline, which seemed to be the last possible date to provide for that. But I think we also recognise it, as there has been in the past, that once the deal is signed off within the European institutions and by the European Parliament, on which I think the last date is the 16th of December, there is the opportunity for it to become operational with retrospective approval from national parliaments. But Esther makes the case well in terms of the politics of that and the significance of that process and the way that the deal's explained. You know, I often think that the UK government, when it shapes so much of what it says about Europe against the prism of UK domestic politics, fails to understand that actually European politicians have domestic politics too. And so I think there's a blind spot there. I mean, I think Esther also makes good points about involving workers and unions, which we've pressed for continuously, and on the level playing field. And of course, we originally sought dynamic alignment on standards and protections. But it looks as if the deal might move to some sort of agreement around non-regression, which would at least be a step. The way in which that state aid has become such a central issue is at one level fascinating, because this is a conservative government which has never shown any inclination to utilize the opportunities for state aid. We spend a third of what Germany spends on state aid, half of what France spends. And I remember arguing as a MP representing a steel city, Sheffield, for the government to do more, but making the political domestic decision not to utilize the opportunities that state aid provided to tackle crisis in the steel industry. But nevertheless, that's been an issue. But I think it's an issue in which the gaps can be bridged.
Thanks, Paul. Danny, can I come to you? Because Esther made the point that jobs will be lost, and there's a sense that there is going to be a serious impact and perhaps some growing inequality. Is that a concern for IBEC, and what do you think can be done to mitigate that? Oh, you're on mute.
Apologies. Just to apologies. Just to echo what everyone's saying. Look, first of all, Brexit is bad for Ireland, right? And therefore, by extension, it's going to be bad for different parts of our society. Some will thrive. Even COVID has had a much more pronounced effect in terms of divides. And it's not even between the haves and have-nots. Some haves have suddenly been dislocated very dramatically. Think of people in the aviation industry who, pardon the pun, were flying high up to a few months ago with no clouds on the horizon in terms of demand. Now that may come back. I don't believe COVID to be as a significant effect as Brexit, actually. I just think Brexit is by far the defining issue. And so what jobs may or may be displaced here goes to an even more fundamental issue, which I think the Republic needs to talk about, is that Britain is by far, because of geography and gravity models and so on, is by far the most important economic entity for Irish SMEs. Ireland is particularly unique. To look at the trade stats from Ireland is to miss the investment that's gone in from globalized forces. They wouldn't, doesn't matter who you're beside for a lot of those investment decisions. But the truth is, for the vast majority of employees and households, the relationship with Britain is still and will continue to be pivotal. And so one question that I would ask that we think about, and I think Matt asked it there in the questions, is what's the signal here? The noise is all personality stuff. Arguably, if you missed the whole May premiership, would you have missed anything in the Brexit story, right? Did anything change during those couple of years? Potentially not. So personalities come and go, but the signal is very clear here and it's happening. But here's one fundamental. We know through the common travel area, it's a bit of a euphemism. It's actually joint citizenship, right? What happens if in one scenario, there's a breakup in the United Kingdom? Right? Do we continue to have a relationship with Scotland in terms of joint citizenship? Can we vote in Scottish elections if we're resident there? And those things go to the heart of the workers' opportunities. The traditional ones from Ireland is that if Ireland gets into trouble, where's the escape valves? And so, these complexities, like let's stop at this point. The constitutional breakup potential in the UK has many asymmetric issues going on. Not least the fact, going back to Matt Carty, in this case, rather than Matt Shannon, but United Ireland, like the Act of United Ireland would allow the citizens of Northern Ireland to become instantaneously European citizens. That's been agreed. Merkel came to Dublin 2 years ago, and probably one of the more significant interventions. in the kind of repayment of the debt about what happened to Eastern Europeans in an act of reunification. So would Northern Irish people be continuing to have that joint citizenship issue on the act of that? So the complexities here of Brexit are by far an economic order issue in contrast to the tragic noise that is COVID. COVID hopefully is only for Christmas. Brexit looks like it could be forever.
Thanks, Danny. And do you think that Brexit will drive greater momentum for unification?
I don't know, because look, here's the economic argument, and I genuinely don't know. But if you said to the citizens of Ireland, the Republic of Ireland in the 1930s, would you not reunify back in? It's in your economic interest. That, you know, there's so much wealth in the UK compared to the impoverishment you have right now. Do we believe that people would say, yeah, that's an act of reunification, we should do that for our economic circumstances in the future? It's identity politics. People don't. I don't believe the economic arguments are overwhelming in reunifications. They appear to people to be at a time and point, but very often it's different emotions and identity.
Thanks, Danny. Paul, does Labour have a view on that, on the Brexit, whether Brexit might drive more momentum towards unification?
No, I mean, I think Danny's right. We could all speculate. I think that, you know, our view is simply that that's a decision for the people in Northern Ireland.
Thanks. Just one other question on preparation. You mentioned at the very beginning, Paul, that your concern about the lack of preparedness, I think was the phrase you used. So how would you define the preparedness for SMEs in the UK? How would you assess the preparedness?
It's very weak. There might have been an opportunity, but COVID has taken away the bandwidth to address the issue in many cases, and I hear that consistently from different business sector groups. That's the simple survival focus that COVID has placed on businesses has meant that there's not been the opportunity to prepare for the impact of the friction that will be at our borders, whether there's a deal or not. I think that there are many sectors where they haven't even kind of recognised there's an issue. I was talking to the Food and Drink Federation last week. Something like 95% of their members are SMEs. They don't export. They don't export to the EU, but they do trade with Northern Ireland. A very large number of them. And many of those haven't factored in that actually there's going to be a different regime from the 1st of January. And it's not helped by the government, which is putting out national newspaper advertisements and everything else saying prepare for Brexit, because the businesses say, well, what are we preparing for? What are the rules? What do we have to do? How is this going to work? And so there's a real problem there.
It's back to that lack of certainty that was mentioned previously. And Danny, I know our food and drink sector appears to be prepared. There was a plan there recently this week. Are there sectors in Ireland that are particularly unprepared in regards to the SMEs?
Well, I think Paul's point is right. It's like the staff room telling you to go study, but won't give you a curriculum.
Right.
You know, so what can you do? So I would contend nobody's prepared until you get the details. Then the question is, can they prepare quickly? And I think that is the argument. It's not just that they're covered, they can't be covered, but are they ready in terms of an adequacy? And I think there's probably a high adequacy that people can adapt. But the truth of the matter is the time has run out and there will be a period of grace, right? This is all non-credible bluff, but by the EU side as well, actually. This will not work perfectly on the 1st of January, and there will have to be a transition. Business was promised a 2-year transition phase. Just because people like to call what we've gone through transition phase, wasn't transition phase, it's still negotiation.
Yeah.
And so the proposition to business is that you have no transition period. You just somehow can, wake up and move into the new regime. If that has to be the case, it has to be the case, but there will be disruption from that. And you won't be able to prosecute people because they'll have a legitimate to bring, go to court in terms of reasonable expectation to fulfill contracts and so on. So we will get to the 1st of January, and then there will be a grace period, even though the negotiators can countenance this type of situation. They need to force the dates. It's not incredible.
Yeah, it makes sense. You can't transition to something until you know what you're transitioning to, and then the transition period has to start. Yeah.
Well, the point is, if you leave one port, you should know what port you're heading for. Otherwise, you are just going out for a day out to just flail around in the ocean somewhere. Yeah.
So one final question, unless somebody else wants to put a question in the chat. But Paul, there's one comment. There's news in the paper today about the fallout of Dominic Cummings and Kane leaving number 10. Do you think that would have any impact or a softening of the attitude in number 10? Is it likely to have any real impact on negotiations?
Goodness me, I'm the last person to speculate on what the internal workings of number 10 are, let alone what the mindset of some of the players is. I mean, this has been a most extraordinary administration. I mean, by contrast with even with the May administration, where you understood where people were where they were trying to go, and how they were trying to get there, even if we disagreed with aspects of it. This has been an anarchic, incompetent, conflicted administration. I guess the point that I would make is that yet again, this kind of underlines the sort of psychodrama within the Tory party that led to the Brexit referendum, that has crippled the talks, that has meant that we've struggled to make progress over 4 years, and even at the final hurdle, 2 days ago they were talking about David Frost quitting. So goodness knows what's going on. I just hope, in the interests of the UK, of Ireland, and the rest of Europe, that we can land an agreement, however slim, by the end of next week.
Thanks, Paul. Danny, I know you have to go, so if you need to drop off, please do. But Esther, I know you wanted to make a comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to say on the preparedness question. I remember when I was working at the ICTU during the transition from the pont to the euro, and we met with business, with government, with NGOs for about 2 years to manage that transition. And it was only as we were working on that, when we knew where we were going, it was a pretty simple thing. And 3/4 of the way through, only then do we identify the hurdles of that transition. So it's only actually when you know, as Danny said, where you want to go and you start working out how you get there, that you identify some of the hurdles. So some of them were, on the switch overnight, you were going to have twice the amount of money you normally would have, and so how would you afford the insurance? So lots of things that would never occur to you until you're actually, moving towards the transition. So this question of how prepared are we, I think we're a lot less prepared than we even think we are. And that you don't hear anybody saying we're ready for this. So I think the situation is probably worse than it's estimated to be. That would be my assessment on that question.
So it's a sense of the unknown unknowns. We don't know what we don't know yet, and we won't know until the time comes. Thank you, Esther. Well, on that note, I'm going to call it a day unless anyone has anything else they'd like to say. I'd like to thank our speakers, Paul Blomfield, Danny McCoy, and Esther Lynch, and in absentia, Matt Carthy. Thanks for your great insights. Really appreciate your time today and your comments. Just for the attendees, I'd just like to draw your attention to TASC, who brought the event to you today. This is the think tank for action on social change. Please have a look at our website, www.tasc.ie, We have a number of interesting events coming up in the next couple of weeks. One on the 18th of November is the launch of a TASC publication on the People's Transition, Community-Led Development for Climate. So after Brexit, we have to think about climate change. So we don't have enough on our agenda. But this report will be launched by Mary Robinson, former President of Ireland and UN High Commissioner, and Diedrich Samson, who's the head of cabinet of the European Commission and Vice President in charge of the Green Deal. So that's on the 18th. And on the 23rd, we continue our TASC conversations with decision makers. Our board member, Kevin Cardiff, will be in discussion with Leo Varadkar, the Taoiseach, and they will discuss, among other things, low pay, inequality during COVID-19, and whether the centre-right cares about social equity. So some interesting events coming up. Please do check our website. You can register for them there. And also you can subscribe to our newsletter and be kept informed of upcoming events. So thank you all for today. This has been live streamed on Facebook, so you'll be able to access it afterwards. And we look forward to seeing you at a future event. Thank you.